Hello, everyone. Welcome to another museum moment. My name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm the education director here at Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and I am really excited about today's episode, as it were. This is, one of those pieces that we had planned for a little while, and sometimes the timeliness of a topic is just really important. This one is all about political connections, political will, political desire, and then how our elected officials act and kind of broad public opinion and how they kind of respond to that broad public opinion. And actually, interestingly, it involves a political figure in his own right, Victor Berger. So without further ado, I'm excited to jump into Victor Berger's story and to share with you guys who Victor Berger was and give kind of a better sense, because I think in the 1920s, he would have been one of those political figures that everyone knew. And I'm guessing right now, and you guys can tell me or put in the comments, how many of you were familiar with the story of Victor Berger before this? And how many of you gained some new insight as we were talking through this today? So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Berger. Victor Berger was born, and this is a very giant blown up picture of his face, in Austria. And he came to the United States with his parents when he was 18 years old. He was actually naturalized because he came, interestingly, he came somehow as their dependent. He was naturalized through them. This comes back later in life as something that people question about him. He initially he comes into New York, he moves to Milwaukee, and he is attracted to Milwaukee by both the active German culture that's here. Milwaukee was known as the German Athens. And he's also attracted to Milwaukee because there is a great labor scene going on. And he becomes a big part of that labor scene. He teaches German at a public high school, and it is there that he actually meets his future wife. We're not going to get into the recriminations of this, but he marries a lady named Meta, who Mrs. Schlittling, as she's called here, Meta Schlittling. It's quite the name. And she was from the South Side. She actually, in her own right, deserves more than a museum moment. In fact, their whole family does. This is a really interesting family photo. You can see it's Victor at the top here, his nephew, Jack Anderson, and then his two daughters. The one who's seated is Doris, and the one who is standing is Elsa. And the whole family is very active in German cultural pursuit. They are active in political life. Meta becomes a school board member and actually sits on the UW-Wisconsin Board of Regents, which has its own kind of political turmoil at the moment. And we'll get to Victor's story in a second, but I loved this in looking at these two young, very turn of the 20th century sorts of ladies here in this picture. Both of them have really interesting trajectories. Elsa becomes a physician and practices medicine, which would not have been, an occupation that many women had in that time. Doris becomes a lawyer. And then later, after her mother's death, and this is this piece here is from Victor Berger's obituary that was in the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. But after their mother's death in 1944, she and her husband start writing for serial radio shows and then television. And she's most notable. She's known they wrote for a show called This Gun for Hire, but they also, notably, she and her husband were the people who originated the show General Hospital. So you can go from socialist in Milwaukee to General Hospital in like one jump. It's an amazing piece of this story. I loved this quote from the Chronicle obituary of Victor Berger. It says, "The family home life of the Bergers was an ideal one and was pointed to by their friends as an example of family devotion, loyalty, and culture. It exemplified in high degree the traditions of the Jewish home, although Mrs. Berger is not a Jewess." And that, to be fair, Victor Berger's public life, is not particularly Jewish. This article talks about how he initially was involved in B'nai Jeshurun. He taught potentially religious school there. He was a member of their Bikor Hoblim Society. They're visiting the Sikh Society for a bit. He never unjoined it, so they take great ownership. But I have to say, his Jewish ethic, the idea of caring for the widow, the stranger, the orphan, that was really deeply rooted into his political life and the life that he built in Milwaukee. He goes on to become before we get to that picture, he goes on to become a pretty well-known political figure in Milwaukee. He is the editor of German newspapers, German socialist newspapers. He takes on a socialist newspaper that becomes a national kind of read. And in the same time, he is organizing the socialist movement in Milwaukee. He's taking this in all sorts of different directions. He is engaging people. Famously, Eugene Debs credits Victor Berger with introducing him to socialism. And socialism in Milwaukee, and of course, this could be a whole museum moment of itself, is really all about engaging the people, the infrastructure of the city, making sure the city is working for those who don't have enough, making sure that there are good public spaces. The city and county park system in Milwaukee is a credit to the leadership of the socialists of the early 20th century. And Victor Berger was a big part of that. He runs for Congress in 1910 and wins, runs again. And actually, this image is from a senatorial campaign, which he does not win. He's on the socialist ticket, but he remains in Congress. Interestingly, this piece, and actually the last picture too, are from the Wisconsin Historical Society's Victor Berger collection, which is amazing. There's actually some great curriculum there as well. But you can see that this has been, and in fact, it was, someone marked this up. So it says, for an early, general, and lasting peace of the Russian kind. And remember, this is from 1915. This is during World War I. And he is really, one of his big platforms at this time is pacifism, staying out of the war, not getting involved in World War I. One of the things that I find to be really interesting about this particular banner is it says for free speech, which was a big platform of his, but also against race hatred. Also a big platform of his. He takes on the KKK in his editorials often. He takes on World War I in editorials often. And more than his political stances as a congressman, the thing that actually gets him dinged politically the most are these editorials. So for instance, the Postal Service at one time takes away his second-class mailing rate because they say that he's aiding the enemy during World War I. That becomes a big political battle. We're about to get to the other political battle of his life, political and judicial battle. But first, I want to give you a sense of what he says about the KKK and really what he's thinking in, this is from a little bit later, it's from 1923. And he says, I consider the Ku Klux Klan an organization built upon race hatred and religious hatred. I know it to be antisocial and anti-American, a menace to rich and poor, to workers and capitalists alike. I believe the Klan to be an utterly venomous, cowardly, and despicable gang of marauders hiding under the cloak of secrecy and mysticism and patriotism. If the Socialist Party of America would not scorn and reject Ku Klux Klan votes at any and all times, I would reject the Socialist Party, which I feel is a really impassioned way to talk about the KKK at a time we don't think about political characters standing up to racism, that this was a big part of who he was. Again, anti-war was another big piece of who he was, and this becomes his big political battle. He is found to be guilty of the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act says that because he gave aid to the enemy during World War I by voting against World War I, that he shouldn't be able to be seated. And in fact, there was a big federal trial in Chicago. Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the future baseball commissioner, is the judge in that trial and is virulently anti-German, which Berger is Austrian, and, very prejudiced against the people who are on trial. It's Berger and 4 other politicians, city politicians, I believe. And they're all given 20-year sentences in jail. And Berger is in this, and there's suddenly this sense that you can't sit in Congress, if you're in the middle of this kind of federal court system, if you're in the middle of this trial, he says he's appealing this, and he ends up appealing it to the Supreme Court, where on a technicality, they say, nope, you can't be found guilty in this way. But in this appeal, in this moment in which he's in between appeals and sitting in front of the Supreme and sitting in Congress, a group of his peers in Congress say, we're not going to seat you. And it becomes this kind of ongoing battle. And Berger says, after they say, no, you can't sit, he says, remember, gentlemen, you may exclude me once, you may exclude me twice, but the 5th District of Wisconsin cannot permit you to dictate what kind of man is to represent it. If representative government shall survive, you will see me or a man of my kind. Let us hope many men of my kind in the nation's legislature. Therefore, whatever decision you make, I will just say au revoir. I'll be back. And one of the things that comes out of this period is that Berger is not allowed to sit, and they have a special election in Milwaukee, and it's actually a really interesting special election. He is going against a fusion candidate. The Republicans and the Democrats in this moment decide we need to defeat Victor Berger. So what better way to do this than by pooling our resources for the 5th District of Wisconsin? And in that moment, he wins. He wins his almost 5,000 more votes than his opponent, whose name is Henry H. Bodenstad. And he goes back to Congress, and they refuse to seat him again. In the votes against him and having him be in Congress or not, there's actually only one person who votes in favor of him. It is another German immigrant, a guy from the 2nd District in Wisconsin, a guy named Edward Voigt. And I think this is the kind of messaging that I feel is so important to recognize in our political leadership right now. Voigt, who is really out on the limb here, says, you may laugh and scoff, gentlemen, but I know Victor Berger. No man can devote his whole life and fortune to the great cause of endeavoring to better the conditions of the toiling millions, stand by his principles like a rock of Gibraltar, regardless of personal consequences, without being morally great. Victor Berger's name will stand in the future as that of a martyr to a great cause, the rights of free speech, free press, and representative government. You may say that Victor Berger is a traitor, but if you do, you got to say that there are 25,000 traitors in the 5th District of Wisconsin. So Berger initially in this waiting time period until 1921, he's unseated. There's a big wave of Republicans who come in with Warren G. Harding coming in as the president, and he re-wins in the 1924 election, and comes back in 1922, and comes back in 1923 and is seated, and is actually kind of greeted by his colleagues as kind of a welcome figure. At this point, you're a little further away from World War I, and there's not this same sense that of immediacy. You're also a little bit outside of a Red Scare that had been going on. The Red Scare that had been going on comes in the wake of the Russian Revolution and all of the stuff that's going on, and there's this real sense that they have to take down the Socialist Party. If you ever want to look into stuff about the Palmer raids or the IWW, this is a good time to look at. It's also where it's also where J. Edgar Hoover gets his initial start, Palmer raids. But he comes and he has a profound impact. And he comes back to Milwaukee. He loses his seat in 1928 when there is another presidential election with a Republican candidate sweeping. And he continues to write and be active until his death in 1929. He dies. He's hit by a streetcar, which I feel is a little suspicious. So I would think there's more to be said about any of these subjects. Clearly, I could have done a whole week on Victor Berger, but I'm going to compress it into 14 short minutes. Thank you so much for joining me today on this museum moment. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the Free Soviet movement. And I'm excited to hear about your responses, relationship, anything that you guys have about that. Thanks very much. If you've enjoyed this and any museum moment, please feel free to make a donation at jewishmuseummilwaukee.org.